So welcome back.
Welcome. Yeah, episode 23, Ali.
And what are we talking about today?
Well, before that,
hmm
throughout rethinking trauma and transition, we challenge the stigma surrounding trauma and the healing through our podcast. We aim to empower those who are experiencing these challenges, providing them with the knowledge and language necessary to embark on a transformative journey towards a more fulfilling life.
I always want to jump right in, don't I?
You know,
hmm
we are talking about is stereotypes.
Well, I suppose we're talking about gender stereotypes, aren't
Mm, yeah,
we? Those assumptions that maybe drive us up the wall, those moments where we find ourselves like gritting our teeth.
right.
Like when I would walk into a garage forecourt and they assume I know nothing about my car.
Absolutely. Of course you don't. Being deliberately provocative.
Well, that led to an interesting experience with the mechanic when he obviously thought I was exaggerating when I told him I had no brakes.
Mm,
Wasn't my fault. He took it fast onto the ramps. He came back a little bit more white faced when he left. I had been very clear.
yeah.
He had
Well,
metaphorically patted me in the head.
right. And who was the one driving the car beforehand? Who was the one who knew how squishy or how unresponsive the brakes were?
Me. hmm
Mm, yeah.
hmm Yeah, that was an interesting drive to the garage.
I'm sure it was. Yeah.
The reason we thought this would be quite an interesting conversation was because you and I have had some quite light-hearted conversations about this over things
Yeah.
that have generally driven us nuts or
Mhm.
because of the assumptions people make. And I'm thinking of one incident in particular for you, Rich.
Right, go on. It's almost as bad as your brake failure.
Mm-hmm. Last time he underestimated me when I said the brakes aren't working.
Right.
So you had an assumption based experience recently, didn't you?
Well, yeah, this gone, yeah, back a few months. So for those people who aren't aware, is if you buy Eco for washing up liquid, you can sponsor us, by the way, if you so wish.
Good call.
Is that if you go to certain shops, they get refills, so it's a little bit cheaper than actually going to buy a brand new bottle and or environmental stuff and all that sort of malarkey. Anyway, so the lady in the shop made the presumption is that I don't know which I wanted. Was it non-bio or bio? And did the wife tell me which one I had to go and buy? Because yeah, obviously men never have to go and buy washing liquid.
Now, I freely hold my hand up. I probably compounded the issue because when you told me that, I burst out laughing and went, seriously, you're telling a woman about gender stereotypes?
Mm.
Which was very wrong of me because the point you were making was very valid. And it's not about gender, it's about
No,
assumptions.
it is. Yeah.
But because we make it about gender,
Mm. Well, as the old saying goes, is if you assume something, you make an ass out of you and me.
well, I was thinking about that this week, not making an ass out of you and me, but about the stereotypes and the assumptions.
Mm.
And it struck me that if you go back to probably the last 1990s, you've got John Gray's book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus.
Mm-hmm.
And while that was really good in terms of breaking down different communication styles, it suddenly occurred to me that actually that was the epitome of gender stereotyping. Because in order for that book to work, it kind of assumed that there were massive differences between the genders, between male and female.
Mm-hmm.
And that got me thinking because I was wondering how much of that is actually true and how much of that do we enforce by believing it's true.
Well, it's kind of a generalization, isn't it, across the board of women are this and men are that. Whereas in reality, we're more alike than we are different, except on the extreme ends of things, when there is obviously those major significant differences between men and women.
Well, if I look at the challenge sometimes in mental health is that there's almost that stereotype that because men don't talk about their emotions, it's almost like chicken and egg. Which comes first, which? Is it the stereotype or is it the behaviour?
Well, yeah.
And at which point does one reinforce the other and almost create the other?
I think that's for philosophists.
Philosophers.
Yeah. Well, I think it doesn't help stereotyping when there's the likes of Homer Simpson. There is Al Bundy.
Mm-hmm.
There is Peter Griffin.
Mm-hmm.
And men in these kind of situations are portrayed as bumbling idiots. And the only way they can get by is because of the wife. And she goes round and sorts everything out. And so this portrayal really, I think, has a negative impact on how men are perceived in society.
Well, I think it has a negative effect on both men and women on how we're perceived. Because that comes back to the I have no brakes comment. Or
there's that pressure then, I suppose, plenty on women being told to women is you can do it all. You can have the kids, you can have the career, you can have a nice, tidy, clean house, you can have a big, flashy sports car. Then realise, I can't live this way. It's impossible. Someone's got to give.
Well, that's about balance, and I think that applies equally to men as well.
Oh, yeah.
Because if we assume that the gender roles, if we assume the childcare roles, then the experience of parenthood is very different for fathers to mothers, for each part of that partnership. And I'm very conscious that when I was growing up, for instance, my dad was self-employed, so he worked from home and he was his own boss. My mum was out at work, and I remember her saying that when she went back to work, there was a point where she suddenly realised that us as young children, if we fell over, if we hurt our knee or whatever, then the person we turned to was my dad, not my mum, because he was the one that was there and more available during the day and that sort of stuff. And it wasn't anything to do with gender. And actually, she felt that difference there because of that. So a lot of it isn't about gender then, it's about availability.
It is. But there's also that case as well is if that child is still in school and that child has an accident or gets hurt in some way, often reported, it's always the woman who gets phoned up, even though the husband may be at home.
Yeah.
He may be working at home or whatever he's doing at home, and the wife is doing whatever she's doing. But it's always her who gets phoned up as seen as the primary caregiver and everything else.
Well, it's also, and this is a personal pet peeve, the number of times I've heard men saying, "Oh, I'm babysitting tonight."
Or they've been told that, or somebody has said, "Yeah, he's babysitting." So if he's parenting, looking after his own kids.
Yeah. And again, there's the assumption of roles and responsibilities there. But how often do you hear that phrase used in terms of women? I actually don't know that I've ever heard, unless that's almost like an aunt, sister, whatever role you're babysitting, but never if you are the parental figure. Is it almost used that you are babysitting that night? But that also comes back to the other assumptions that we've got. So if we go back to Men don't talk about their emotions. Men don't communicate.
We're emotionless, apparently, apart from anger. That's all men can express is anger.
Well,
Never humour.
I don't think that's true.
Hmm.
Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many top male comedians.
Well, I said the only two expressions that men can really express apparently are either anger or humour.
Or humour, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in a previous episode, we were there was like a comment about because we were talking about communication,
Mhm.
and there was a comment about how sometimes you come home from work and you're hijacked, you're and hijack's the wrong word now, ambushed as you come in through the door because metaphorically the weather report's changed where you're out or you're unaware that the fact that the storm clouds are looming and you've just walked straight into a force 10 hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reflecting on that because the advice I give a lot in terms of like business coaching is manage out surprises.
Yeah.
Yet, how often do we do that in our private lives?
Probably very little.
Yeah, I know from conversations with you that that's something that you're familiar with as well in terms of manage out surprises.
Mm.
And it works really well in that setting. Yet we consistently have a habit of managing in surprises sometimes in our communication with key people in our lives.
Yeah. Is that because some people think holding on to information is holding on to power?
Well, funny you should say that because I was just wondering whether or not this was almost about point scoring, about wanting to be in the right.
Yeah.
And
I'll give you an example of holding on to information pointlessly. So out in Northern Ireland, we haven't been told anything, but some lad's gone down to the laundrette and it's run by the wives. And one of the wives said to one of the lads, well, you want to hurry up and you want to get your washing done pretty quick, don't you? And he's like, what are you talking about? Oh, you're going out patrolling 2 hours. So the wife had known at least 2, 4, how many hours it was beforehand they were due out to go on patrol. We should be hearing it from it should become direct from chain of command, however many hours in advance that we're getting ready to go out somewhere.
That strikes me that's about the power of the network. So they did studies in businesses, effective networks, and one of the most effective networks was the smokers, because it spanned all levels.
Yeah.
It was like a leveling universal experience.
Okay.
Now, interestingly enough, with the change in terms of like those stereotypes, I don't know if they've ever repeated that study to see if that still rings true. But they found that actually, as a result, that those who participated in that network were much better informed. They had much better overview in terms of everything that was going on with them in the business. And they had much stronger interconnections as well that spanned traditional levels.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like a network issue with the laundry.
But it also reminds me of is in Blackadder, where he goes up. I can't remember the whole exact sketch is. So we're going to repeat the same plan again, advance forward onto line, and who knows? It's a top secret plan. Do you remember this?
No, which variation of Blackadder was it? I take it was like the World War.
Blackadder Force.
Right, okay.
And it goes somewhere along the lines of, so who knows? It'll be Lord Kitchener, his wife, his wife's friends, and the tortoise called George or something. I can't remember the whole sketch, but it's telling everybody else, apart from the relevant people.
I think we do that in our relationships too.
Mm.
Is that also about how much we own our own behaviours?
Possibly. We don't. Maybe we don't want to admit those faults or those faults or behaviours, traits to whoever may be married to or going out with, but it's easier to a group of friends.
Well, I want to explore that a bit more because that would seem to imply that those behaviours and traits are permanent.
No, I don't think they're permanent.
Okay. So if they're not
People
permanent,
do change.
hmm?
Old dogs do learn new tricks.
Well, we're constantly changing, aren't we?
I'm going to guess then that is potentially how comfortable does that person feel communicating with someone? Are they mind reading with an expectation of what is going to happen next when they do tell that person wherever it is?
Well, I suppose a classic could be when you and I set up to do podcasts, isn't it?
Mm.
And there's almost like this preset script we go through of, right, who's setting up the podcast, who's sending out the link, what time are we doing that, which day of the week is it, who's calling who, because otherwise that hasn't happened.
No.
Because we've assumed that all of the information is in the previous communication.
Yeah. Or sometimes is, I've told you this, but I've told you that in my mind, but not actually physically.
So, like, you and I will have conversations where I've gone, I feel like I'm missing the first half of that conversation. Can we backtrack a bit? Or you've said similar to me. Or
that's also
or the fact that now when I get really retentive and go, right, okay, what time, Rich? Who's calling who? I know you're laughing at me, but the reason I'm doing that is to make sure that that's all clear.
Yeah. So that's really goes on then. It is about communication styles between men and women, or between men and men and women and women.
Between individuals.
Yeah, exactly. And how men are generally perceived as not talking a lot. So that's kind of like then is communication styles between men and women, men and men, women and women, isn't it? And we presume the men talk less, the women talk more. But that's all about context, because the man is generally quite happy. He can go off, sit down by the fishing by the riverbank all day, and he's happy as Larry. And a woman can do the same thing. Whereas some people go, well, that's really boring, sat down there by the riverbank all by yourself, watching the world go by.
Is that again about assumptions we make about people?
It is, yeah. As we said, as mentioned in the beginning, you're assuming something. That's the mother of all fuck-ups.
Yeah. Like the assumption that because I'm female, I won't own power tools.
Outrageous. You can't have power tools.
Outrageous. I know.
I know.
Or that my toolbox will be filled with pink and flowery tools. That I won't know how to strip back a cable.
Yeah. Well, when I was working for a large company as a fitter, there was a young lass, she was an apprentice, early 20s at the time. One of the older blokes, he made a comment on to her because physically she's not that strong. She's not very big. So she couldn't do the studs on top of whatever she's working on. One of the blokes said to her is, you really shouldn't be working here, should you? You even want to be down at the nail salon painting people's fingernails. So he got pulled. She told the line manager, and he got pulled over the coals for that, because that's outrageous. Because there's another lass who's working there as well. and she's a fantastic fitter. Again, they both lack the physical strength to do the job. So obviously they have to adapt and overcome and use other means of taking off nuts and bolts.
But that assumes that every male that walks through the door will have the physical strength for the job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everyone will. And I suppose that comes back to the assumptions we make and how much of our conversations, of our interactions are assumption based. How much are about the roles and expectations we place on others, and what if we strip that back?
Yeah.
What if we assumed that our partners, regardless of gender, were good at communicating? We just had to assess and learn how they communicated.
Yeah, exactly. And as we were chatting the other day, I was making a comment about is gender considered men are poor communicators? And I made to you the comment is when we were hunting gatherers, men generally went out and did hunting gathering. So I did the hunting. So if men are poor at communicating, they wouldn't have they would have killed the animal to get the hunt back in for food for the tribe. It's just a different way of being able to talk, communicate, and get a job done.
Well, actually, is that about what we're curious about?
What do you mean?
Right. So if you and I are talking about kind of random topics and stuff, you probably noticed one of my pet phrases is "tell me more about that."
Yeah.
How often do we explore topics with our relatives, with our significant others, with our friends? How often do we ask, "Tell me more about that"?
Oh, that depends how curious the cat is, isn't it? And if we're interested in that topic. But does that really matter, though? Because if that person's got something to teach, it's worth learning about, is it not?
And how do we know if we're going to be interested in the topic unless we open it up and explore it more?
Yeah, that's assumptions, isn't it? But also I think that is how well that person is at telling or informing that person about the topic. Because there's some very knowledgeable people out there and your eyes glaze over listening to them.
Well, there's also a lot of people that that need a little bit more time in terms of pulling their thoughts together or being able to link their response with the thought. So there's almost that sense of actually, I don't really know what I'm experiencing right now. I know I'm experiencing something. I don't quite have a name or a label for it. There is something going on with me yet, but it's kind of still in the stewing and soup stage. And is that maybe a bit almost like my thinking face? So you know that the minute I get my thinking face on, I can see you sit back and going, yeah. And I know in conversations with other people, when other people have gone, she's gone really quiet. Is that really weird? And you've gone, yeah, thinking. Because you know that there's something going on. You've just got to kind of give it a bit of space and a bit of time. But that's because you know my cues. But is that also about sometimes in our relationships with other people, with our friends, with our family, with all of them, saying, actually, there is something in my head I haven't quite put form to it yet. So I need a wee bit of processing time before I do.
Very much so. It's kind of a bit like that discussion we had with Kim, isn't it? And for some people, when they're making that disclosure, it's going to be the first time. I think what she said, 20 years was the average. Yeah. And how long had it been? So they've decided it's 20 years they're going to make that disclosure. But how long is that person then taking to make that phone call or send that email? You know, this happened to me. I think I need to talk to somebody about it. Is that an immediate phone call? Or is it going to be, you know what, they're not quite ready yet. And half an hour later, they're ready.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 2-3 weeks later, they're ready.
Yeah. And I think if we take that and apply that to our assumptions we make about other people, then I suppose the other assumption is that when somebody voices something, they've said it the way they want to straight off.
Mm.
And maybe that again comes back to curiosity and putting aside our knee-jerk reaction to something and saying, can I sense check that with you?
Mm. So I was having a chat with a client last night towards the end of the session, and it's talking about listening. So he was saying is when his wife's talking to him, goes over his head, he shuts down. So I asked him, is she talking to you, with you, or at you?
Mm.
And what's the distinction there? So it talked about a whole host of other things as well was going on physiologically. Well, I said, are you also in the process of making conversation to be prepared as to what to respond to what your wife is saying? And that's, I think, I know I'm guilty of doing it, and I expect a lot of people else are, is preparing something in the head without really listening to what that person is going to say and go, blah, 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 blah. And I go, oh, yeah, really got that wrong, didn't I?
So we're responding based on assumptions.
Mind reading.
Mind reading. Making shit up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what if we laid aside those gender stereotypes?
What if we laid aside not just gender, all stereotypes?
Mm-hmm. Good call.
Mm.
And instead picked up curiosity more.
Mm.
Because curiosity is the ultimate assumption buster, isn't it? And if I'm curious, I quite like curious because it's a really huge, huge experience. It doesn't leave you room to be angry, irritated, or annoyed because it's so big.
How big's big?
Massive.
Massively big.
Massively big, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kind of crowds out everything else and just leaves curious.
Yeah. I don't think there's any blame, shame, guilt attached with that either, is there?
No, it's a really neutral type of emotion that just says, I'm interested. I want to find out more. And there's none of the negative stuff at all in there.
And that's like what?
That's like openness.
Yeah.
And listening and hearing.
And what would you like to have happen with that openness?
There to be an awful lot more of it.
Yeah, sounds good.
Mm-hmm. So
I just got visions of massive plains of grassland and big open space.
That's cool. What else do you notice about those big open plains and that grassland?
It's overcast in the far out in the distance.
So what do you think your takeaways are from our conversation today?
It is assumptions are the mother of all fuck ups. And if you assume something, you make an ass out of you and me. There's some very, very good ladies who are fitters, just as there are men who are good at fitters as well. And I'm sure there's some very good men who are good at putting nail polish on.
Well, capability is not about gender.
No.
And communication is not about gender.
Yeah. It's how we communicate.
Yeah.
And are we getting that message across?
And are we curious enough to explore more
Mm.
and give space to find out?
Yeah. Because like your mechanic, he fucked around and found out, didn't he?
I did spend at least a minute and a half trying to explain in umpteen languages exactly how little breaks I actually had.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah.
I think that my favourite phrase was when he came back and he looked at me and he went, "You have no breaks." I was like, "Shit, Sherlock." like he was telling me for the first time, really.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What's your takeaways, Ali?
That we all have that frustration when we are stereotyped, when we are put in a box that limits or underestimates us.
Mm.
Because your eco-over refill experience assumed that you didn't have you didn't have the intelligence to figure that out for yourself. Two, that you didn't know the difference, and three, that obviously because you were male, that all must be true.
Oh.
You know, and you're kind of like, how many of what? But those experiences happen to everybody.
Mm. Yeah.
And that's about, don't we know, sometimes they are amusing. I mean, I've dined out in that no break story for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you know, when you were having the rant at me about the ecover one, I was quite freely very amused by it. Very amused. It was like the shrieking irony of it. I was like, I love it. But
I might send her the podcast.
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
But it just seems so much simpler. That instead of kind of trying to break stereotypes or whatever, it's just about giving all people, the space to, one, be more curious, two, drop the assumptions and sense check how many assumptions have I made in that. And it might mean that you're an awful lot more thorough in terms of your processes, like, you know, okay, so when are we meeting? What medium are we meeting on? Who's calling who? You know, because we have learned that if we're not that thorough, then
it doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen.
Well, it does happen, but it takes longer.
It takes longer, yeah. And maybe that's also, if we give each other the space, then we suddenly find that those experiences of, because see when I see that men struggle to express their emotions, what I also hear is, I am not heard when I attempt to.
Mm-hmm.
And that applies across both sexes too, all genders.
But there's also with that as well, I think, Callie, is it's potentially more women dominated as therapists. So men may not want to go to a female therapist, and she may not have the best approach for that particular individual.
Well, again, I'm going to challenge you in that, Rich, because is that not a gender-based stereotype as well? Because is that not about finding a person that you can relate to?
I think, though, in this case, it has to be how that individual is seeking treatment and who from. And that person has to be comfortable with whom they're getting it from.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly. But I would say that that's not necessarily, again, about gender, but it's about personality.
Possibly. There have been, so I'm listening to is, some people have said is, or men have said they've gone to a therapist, that therapist has been female, and she wasn't listening to their cares and concerns, she just threw everything back at them. she dismissed them what they had to say. Whether that is that particular individual and that's how she treats everybody else, or not, I don't know.
I would say that's about the individual.
Mm.
But I understand if that's your first experience of reaching out for support and help, and that's been your primary experience, why that can have a lasting impact.
Yeah.
And that saddens me.
Mm.
But that's probably the reason why we're having the conversation. And the topic of today's podcast, anyway, isn't it? Is about stereotypes, about assumptions, about gender roles. And it spans everything. You know, and this is where like conversation gets a bit heavy. You know, it's everything from assuming that actually domestic violence is a gender specific experience. It's not.
Yeah. And that's something we can look at later, isn't it, anyway?
And it is, yeah. So for me, that comes back to curiosity. And owning your own stuff ups and your own assumptions and not being scared to reflect that and going, yeah, actually, I made a huge number of assumptions there. And that's my fault that didn't work out the way it did. And I'm going to own that and I'm going to change it.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing wrong with saying, actually, yeah, I didn't have enough information. I actually think that's really useful.
Mm-hmm.
It helps you do something different next time.
Yeah.
Until next time, Rich.
It is. So please do like, review, share, and all that other good stuff.
And you can catch us on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube and Amazon Music, to name but a few.
Yep.
And until you listen next time,
thank you very much for listening.
Open up your curiosity and drop your assumptions.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.